So what I want to do is, yes, EMA. So really what I want to do is to sort of try and sort of give you some tips, as Cheryl was saying, in relation to approaching the EMA. There is EMA sessions that are going. There's some more general, generic ones. So I'm not looking at things specifically, but I will make some sort of specific points that I hope will help you, whether you're doing the EMA in relation to A229 or A340. So really what it is just to, like, I don't know if you're anything a bit like myself, but sometimes I need to hear the same thing a few times before it actually sinks in. So probably more than a few times, but really want to sort of help you in different approaches that you might not necessarily have considered in relation to the EMA. So the other thing I want to do is not just thinking about the immediate future in terms of the EMA, but also towards the far future. In particular, for those of you that more than likely, those that are doing A229 who might be considering to do A340 in the future. So one of the things I would say that I say to my students at the start of the year before you start any module, you sort of need to look a little bit backwards. So really start thinking about, rather than just reading things from start to finish, you need to be a bit more strategic in how th you approach things. So what I mean by that is looking at the end goal. What is the end goal? What do you need to achieve to get through the module itself successfully? And ultimately, that is to look and see what is the final assessment. The final assessment does tend to be an EMA, at least with A3, A229 and A340, it is an EMA in a conventional setting, hence that's why I'm putting this tutorial together and focusing on those two aspects. A34, A350 is quite different, so this is a bit of, shall we say, an interesting EMA, but it's just they decided to try something different, and that's what they tried to do. So we won't go on too much about that. So what I want to do is just focus more generally on the EMA. So what do you need to do? So more specifically, although I've said to you, I don't want you to, well, I'm not saying I don't want you to use the chat thing. It's just I can't see it. So it's not that I'm just trying to be extra rude that than I normally am. So please do use the microphone. This session is really for you. It's not, as I would say, an opportunity for me to go and talk at you and try to pretend that I'm wonderful or anything like that, which you can see that's not the case. So it's there to try and help you as best as you can. So I will do my best to endeavor to try and answer any of the questions that you might have. So the EMA question and the module, which I've more or less just said to you, it is about, looking at what the end goal is. So although, I'll be talking about the immediate EMA, if you are thinking about, I think it's probably unlikely that anyone is doing A340 thinking about going back into A229, but if you are, fair enough. It's just trying to get you sort of EMA focused that's shared between these two different modules. So, what is the EMA itself? And it's one of those things that, and I suppose it is easy for me to say that, it's not so scary because I don't have to do it, but I do have to assess it. But for you, you might feel it is a bit nervous and a bit nerve-wracking. So I want to try and break down some of those aspects and those barriers. So the EMA, like anything else, depending what start where we're looking at the EMA, is part of a longer journey. We got a few weeks before, so it is again part of that journey in relation to that. So you still need to start thinking forward thinking, organization and preparation. So that ultimately should bring about success in relation to the EMA itself. You can see I've done my best to find inspirational images through Google. So the other thing I want to try and get you to do is, and I feel very much a hypocrite when I'm saying this about, being proactive rather than reactive. So hence this is where the forward thinking aspect comes into it. So it is about, self-initiated behavior, and that comes through knowledge about how you approach things. And hence that's why I said to you looking at the end goals and think of the strategic routes in which you would approach that. So what I will be doing today is going back over material which you probably have already looked at or maybe not looked at, but not show sort of tricks and sort of ways in which you should approach things, or in other cases, for a future module that you'll be doing. So in some ways, when I'm talking about certain aspects, it's not just about classical studies, but modules themselves in general with the Open University. So again, about being proactive, acting in advance of situations and taking control of a situation, which sounds very dynamic. But when I'm saying all these things and trying to underline, emphasize these things, I do feel a bit of a hypocrite because I will tend to do an awful lot of things at the last minute. So this is something, I can't remember what we call these things, but it was one of these sort of word stuff things that was very popular a few years ago. Thankfully, it sort of died down, but the Open University seems to use it for absolutely everything that people throw in words that we think were important. But hence, just get wrapped this one about being sort of strategic and strategic thinking. The other one here is what do we mean by that? But as achieving a goal and sort of setting those goals in relation to thinking forward. This is was it General MacMahon. So I throw that one, although spelling is slightly off, but never mind. So the other thing, a skill that I would like you to think about and become much more aware of is about being reflective and being reflective thinking and using that as an active manner. So this is something, in my teaching this year I've been much more focusing on. There isn't really too much of that in relation to A340, and there is two exercises part of assessment in A229, but it is a very beneficial element in relation to how you approach the EMA. Now, what I mean by that is giving yourself breaks to try and think about the topic area or think about a particular source material that you're looking at, or even thinking about the assessment question to allow it to sort of sink in and digest in your mind. Now, it really does depend on your, I suppose, your approach and to study itself. Some people are much more disciplined, certainly much more disciplined than I would be. You might have, say, for example, 2 hours on a Thursday evening or something like that you will commit and dedicate to doing reading and research or whatever it is in relation to a module and into the EMA. But I want to try and bring that reflective aspect much more into your life, into your daily life, and using those opportunities where you can, not necessarily including it within that actual physical study time, but as I said to you, in your general life. So it might be while you're having a shower, watching the dishes, or while you're getting the bus into or outside work, where you start thinking about, I hadn't really thought about that and how I might approach the question. Or maybe if I put these two sources together, we could think about maybe sort of develop and build on certain ideas and how the two sources might relate to each other or how a source might look as an individual. So it might be useful again, depending, and it's a bit old-fashioned about, maybe writing down some thoughts you might have had on a piece of paper. Or what you can do on your phone is you can make notes in relation to that. Just these sort of moments that sort of pop into your head and you think like, oh yeah, I could add that into it. Or maybe this is something, a different avenue I could explore in relation to the assessment question, as I just said. So I'm trying to make you a little bit more enthusiastic in relation to dealing with the EMA to make it sort of, as I said to you, less sort of scary. And you might think about, well, where do I start? And that these sort of questions themselves sound fairly easy and straightforward, but sometimes, it is a matter of just getting yourself motivated to sit down and think about how you're going to approach things. So that's what I'm sort of trying to do tonight, is sort of break down that barrier and that procrastination, which I know is something that I'll be very guilty of doing myself. So start ultimately with the EMA question. So that seems fairly straightforward and obvious, and it goes back to the point I said to you at the very beginning about when you're looking at the module overall. Look at the EMA question and work backwards to see what type of assessment and how the assessment is building up towards the EMA. When you're starting, the first thing you really do when you're looking at the first block, and any block you deal with, is look at the assessment question that's relevant to the block. That'll make you much more productive in how you approach the topic in relation to that block material. Depending on the module itself, in particular, we're looking at A340, they do expect you to include some additional sources. You are given a portfolio like you were given, or as you are given in A229, but the portfolio in A229 is that portfolio in which you use. A340, slightly different. You must use three of the sources within the portfolio, but you're expected to bring in some additional sources. So it's prudent to have that in your mind as you move through the module about which sources you might want to include. So anyway, as with the EMA, obvious, start with the EMA question. Now I'm just going to give you a general one. And this question here is, what was the role of the emperor? So you feel like, that seems fairly simple and straightforward, but you can see it's an extremely broad question. And it's not specifying which emperor that you need to look at. And hence, this is where the portfolio of sources can be quite useful, because at least it gives you certain boundaries in relation to do that. In some cases, it'd be a topic that either you sort of read through or wasn't that interesting, and you feel like, well, actually, I don't know much about that topic at all. So I would think about, okay, as I said to you, it's a very broad question. So how would I actually think about and dealing with that assessment question? So you need to think about what is an actual EMA. Now we know that the EMA means end of module assessment, but end of module assessment can mean different things. As I said to you, A229, A340, the EMA is very similar, 3,000 words to write an essay. For A340, or A350, apologies, it's something different. You have some sort of curatorial aspect and you have some sort of essay that you write, but it's very different from what you do for A229 and A340. So what is the task? The EMA, as I've just said to you, is an essay. But to try and show you in some ways, sort of to help you in relation to that task, there are actually different types of essays. Now, the one that you need to focus on is ultimately to the bottom right, which is an argumentative essay. This is where you attempt to persuade the assessor of your position in relation to a particular assessment question. The reflective essay, as I've mentioned about being reflection, is more about focusing on your own development and how you engage with the topic area, your own experience. Hence, sometimes seen as expressive writing, where it's written more or less in the first person. And in relation to A229, I think it's part of part two of TMA2, and I think it's part two of TMA4, if I remember correctly. There's a little bit of a reflective exercise, I think, in A340, but again, I'm sort of getting a bit modules tend to get blurred into each other when I put myself under pressure. The analytical essay is quite different. This is where you're focusing very much on a subject area. There is no analytical essay in relation to A229, but there is in relation to A340, where you need to engage critically with a piece of scholarly writing. Now, the analytical aspect helps students, or the idea is to help you in relation to engaging critically with modern scholarship. How modern scholarship engages with ancient sources, how they develop ideas from those ancient sources to help you ultimately incorporate that analytical engagement of modern scholarship and put that into an argumentative essay. But the most important essay that you're dealing with is the argumentative essay. Now, oh yeah, I was trying to make that even more dramatic. This is me trying to show off a little bit because I found this, so I wanted to incorporate. This is coming from Aristotle's Ethics, and I'm slightly amused because Aristotle seems to be getting blamed for an awful lot of things in relation to putting an essay together. And this one sort of sounds quite good, using sort of ethos, logos, and pathos in relation to actual essays. How realistic this is, I don't really quite know, but hopefully you'll see the logic and where I'm going with this. It's just again trying to think about the different roles of essays, but really the most important one is the latter one, which is pathos, which is about getting your audience to feel engaged with the topic area and be persuaded. So that is a kind of essay that you need to sort of focus on. So this is coming from Aristotle's rhetoric, which is 4th century BC, and is about the art of persuasion. So this is the three different aspects of persuasion that Aristotle identifies. So again, it's just a way of thinking about things. But you can see, as I said to you, the first one is the reflective one, the second one is engaging with a piece of modern scholarship, but really the latter one here is about being persuaded. You're very much audience focused. So the audience focus that you need to think about and you need to consider for the EMA is your assessor. For both A229 and A340, there will be two assessors. The first marker, and lo and behold, the second marker is called the second marker. The first marker will tend to be your own tutor, and the second marker will tend to be another tutor. So these are the people that you're writing towards. And as I would always tell to people, like you should be used to your tutor at this stage. They are not expecting you to write something that's a piece of very deep scholarship in relation to a topic that you spent years working on. We all know what it's like and the position that you're in writing as a student. So what you are doing is writing towards not necessarily not an expert in the area, but somebody that has a good knowledge of that topic area. So they often talk about, use the term, an informed reader. So that informed reader is, I think, probably the best example is maybe someone that has finished this module and submitted their EMA in a sort of few months a little bit later on. So they know the topic, they know sort of the subject area, so would know what you're saying is fairly credible and be a reasonable awareness of the actual source material. So this is essay types. So this is something that I suppose is useful just to remind myself and do ask a little bit at the end. I will see if I can pass on the PowerPoints if that would be of use to you. So the details about the reflective, analytical essays that I've just talked about, as I said, the reflective, you normally use the first person. You can use the first one when you're talking about the argumentative essay, the persuasive essay, but it's best to try and focus on in sort of that detached objectivity. So you're not necessarily using the word I, but you're sort of thinking about it could be viewed, etc., etc. So have that sort of slight detachment away from the subject area. It gives the impression that you're not necessarily emotionally involved with it. In most cases, you probably wouldn't be, but other people get quite passionate about a topic area. So it needs to be, as is pointed out here, using evidence. That evidence is what I'll talk about later on, which is the ancient sources or those primary sources. Your argument needs to have a logical progression. It also needs to be evidence-based, as I said to you, that evidence coming from those ancient sources, and you need to persuade the reader to accept a particular point of view on a topic. Now, I know I'm just reading out exactly what's here, but that's what you need to achieve in relation to an EMA. Now, when I say that you need to achieve that, that is what you need to do with your discussion and your actual text. Sometimes you just need to make that explicit link to show the assessor how you're using evidence, how you're critically engaging with that evidence, how you might be using scholarship to help you in the interpretation of that evidence to address and answer the actual assessment question. And that is really what will bump most people's up in terms of their grades. Often for me, it's quite a frustration. Students will do a really good critical engagement and sort of leave it at that. Sort of leave the assessor sort of hanging about making that link to answering and addressing the assessment question. So it really is just a matter of using a few more words at the end of a paragraph to show how you are actually and remind the assessor how you're addressing the assessment question. At the same time, it's not just about sort of flagging up and highlighting or signposting that to assessor. It's also helping you in relation to reminding yourself how you are addressing and answering that actual assessment question. So these are important things to think about when you're dealing with any sort of when you're actually writing your text and reviewing it. The other element, which I will tend to focus on in my own tutorials, is about those skills aspect. And you might think, well, what skills do I need? And again, maybe something that you might have missed or you might have ignored because we sort of go through the motions of doing these TMAs, but actually identifying what these skills aspect, hence that's why I was highlighting that aspect about that reflective aspect, is trying to make them much more aware to help you be much more productive in seeking out, developing and refining those skills so you can incorporate it into your discussion of the EMA. So where do you get those skills? Now, one of those ways is to attend a tutorial like this. But the other case is go and look at, and I just tried to use this one about, hard and soft skills. I can't really incorporate these, but it was slightly amused me because we're talking about hard skills and soft skills, so linked in with ice cream, is, about using your knowledge, but ultimately using that knowledge and showing that understanding in relation to the assessment of that assessment question. That's the operational task. It's the dictionary definition about what skills are. So these things do take time. So I'm not going to try and pretend to you that you'll be able to gain all these skills, even from tonight. I would like to pretend I have all these skills, but in many cases, I'm still working on those and refining those. So you do need to be patient with yourself. So that's something else to also be very aware of when particularly if you're writing A229, you might feel a bit frustrated. But these skills, if you decide to follow through and doing A340, it'll help to, that will experience will help you to develop and refine those when you move on to level 3. So people develop skills at different rates. You might even surprise yourself that you feel like you've been sort of not doing as well as you would like to in relation to some of the TMAs, but hopefully after a session like this and focusing on what you need to look at in relation to the EMA, you might be able to feel like much more successful in the EMA that you ever thought you would be. So just be patient with yourself, not try to shove everything into in one go. So where do you
Ardle,
get these
Ard,
skills from?
Ard,
Yes.
sorry, we have a question.
Okay.
Steve has asked a question about the. Oh, it's moved up. Hang on, sorry, it's just moved up. Just need to find it. Here we go. The analytical aspect, as 229 asks for a detailed analysis of the sources. In that regard, where does it become an argumentative essay as opposed to an analytical one?
It's always going to be argumentative all the way through. It says detailed analysis, but you're using that detailed analysis in relation to the actual argument. One of the skills which, it's probably a good idea to just quickly talk about this now in case I forget later on, is that you need to make a decision in relation. You're doing two processes. In some ways, I'm talking about the essay, but you need to separate the critical engagement of those ancient sources. What I'm not saying to you is that you're doing individual source analyses and plopping those into an essay. But when you're going through that process of analysis, you're trying to assess and find and discover points that are related to the argumentative essay. So the analysis is something that happens separate outside of the essay initially, and then you deal with one source, second source, third source, whatever it is. Try to find some of those analytical points that are related to each other to help you to support answering that actual argumentative essay. So the analysis is incorporated into the actual argument. Part of what you need to do when you're doing your critical engagement with those ancient sources and make a decision as to which aspects of that analysis are you going to prioritize that is strongest in relation to addressing the actual argument. What you do not want to do is produce an essay. I'll take it to extreme. In some ways, it's perhaps easier to do that, and also says something about my mind. Is it almost becomes an analytical essay in some ways? It's almost a list of all these different points. You are not trying to cover absolutely everything. Hence, that's why I decided to use a broader topic as an assessment question. You need to make a decision to prioritize what you're going to include. One way in which you prioritize that, as I've already suggested to you, is through the choice of sources you're given in your portfolio. For A229, you're given 10 sources, whether you're doing the Greek option or whether you're doing the Roman option. For A340, I think you're given five, I think it is, or six, and you must use three. But you must also bring in two or three other additional sources. So your prioritization comes from your choice of sources, and further prioritization comes from what you think are the key points from your individual analysis, bringing all those sources together, and then prioritizing what you think are the key points from your sources together. So hopefully that sort of answers that question, Steve.
I don't know if you can hear me or no, but yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, good. No, if you want to, if it's you can ask again a bit later on if necessary, because I know sometimes people sort of talk over you, but that's hopefully. But you're right. The analytical aspect, it is really about the argumentative, persuasive bit, but ana the analytical aspect is your engagement with the actual evidence itself. So find out those skills that you need to develop will come from the module learning outcomes. Where do you get these? You go to the assessment tab. If you haven't seen it already, go to the assessment guide for 8229, look at the learning outcomes, and then it should pop up somewhere. Where? Oh no, I missed that slide. Same sort of process in A340. Assessment guide, learning outcomes. There. You should have something like this. Oh, I got them mixed up. That's so terrible. There we are. Anyway, that's for A229, A340. So that's where you'll find the module learning outcomes. The module learning outcomes are divided into knowledge and understanding, cognitive skills, key skills, and practical and professional skills. The main ones that you need to focus on and prioritize is ultimately knowledge and understanding. And in between knowledge and understanding, understanding is that key aspect. That understanding allows you to think about what you've assessed and evaluated through those ancient sources, and that's how you express your engagement with those sources, and that's what you incorporate into that persuasive argument. You're showing your understanding to the assessor and hopefully persuading them of your position in relation to your ultimate argument. So this is sort of comparing and contrasting the two modules together. You'll see they start off with that knowledge aspect. The knowledge aspect of these is quite similar, looking at political, social, and cultural history and geography. More or less the same thing when you're thinking about A340, again, looking at history and archaeology, but really it's about certain sites, regions, and contexts. That sort of general knowledge aspect. That general knowledge aspect is essential to give you some sort of overview in what you're looking at, particularly in terms of helping you to understand how you will approach ancient sources. Focusing on the understanding aspect is thinking about different types of source materials. And this is something that I would encourage people to actually bring into your discussion. It's not just showing your knowledge of those sources, but showing that if you're looking at literary sources are different from archaeological sources, they're different from, was it visual source, different from literary sources. They all have different sort of um, levels of helping us to understand the past. And it's good to bring this into your discussion because it allows you to assess and evaluate those sources to an extra level. So do mention that you're dealing with different sources. So in particular, say focusing on sort of more broadly about dealing with one particular source, looking at option one for 8229, you're given extracts from Homer. I sometimes get a bit frustrated when these are called sources, but it's actually not the full source. The source is Homer's Iliad or Odyssey, but you're given extracts from that. And often some of these extracts are taken out of context. So you need to think about that. Okay, what does this source, because it's been taken out of context, what does it suggest? What does the context help us to understand when you put it back into the context to understand about the actual source itself? So looking at different types of source materials, looking at the A340, looking about methodologies and interpretation, but really is about different types of source materials. And we're talking about ancient sources. Looking at A229, appreciation, interpretation, just what I've already mentioned about A340. And A340 in this case is about critical understanding of theoretical approaches. Theoretical approaches is not something to be scared about. It's really about just how modern scholarship looks at the past. And that's really about the development of interpretations. Again, interpretation, how scholars have interpreted the ancient source to help you in relation to your interpretation. And then various disciplines. It's just about classical studies, different types of source material sometimes is compartmentalized into different specialists. So archaeologists will focus on archaeological material. Those who are sort of more linguistically orientated will focus on Latin or Greek. So you know where I'm going in relation to that. A340, talking about the contested nature. I like that term about contested nature because all the sources themselves don't have equal value. Also, scholars will have different points of view in relation to the same ancient source. In many cases, that depends on the question they're asking of that source, but that's something to think about when you are engaging with a particular topic with your question in relation to with your EMA question in relation to that topic. Moving on to that cognitive aspect, I'm just going to quickly run through these. It's about just gathering information, that material coming from the module material or off prints. They're given, not off prints, I can't remember what they're called. The stuff they ask you to look at is not part of the actual text block material, but outside the additional reading, whatever it's called, or even sort of the prescribed reading. Think about the different types of source materials, synthesizing a wide range of different primary sources. This sort of goes back into the question I think, I was sort of trying to answer to you, Stephen, in relation to is not incorporating everything, trying to synthesize it and prioritizing what you think is the significant aspects to help you in answering an assessment question. Most of what I'm going to focus on is the ancient sources or primary source, but I will talk about secondary scholarship a little bit later on. Synthesizing again, just trying to give you that general understanding of it. And rather than quoting, paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is useful because it shows the assessor that you're thinking and engaging with that particular source material, particularly literary source material, trying to condense that information and use it more effectively in terms of answering the assessment question. I'm not saying that quoting is a bad thing, but often what some people will do is they'll throw in lots of different quotes and think that those quotes are sort of stringing together and producing sort of a magical discussion that's answering the assessment question. In many ways, this tends to be quite passive, particularly when it's not followed through on discussion. An actual physical text that's been written down as part of the EMA showing how it's linked to addressing and answering the actual assessment question itself. The independent argument, both in A229 and A340, is your contribution, your engagement with the ancient sources, your interpretation to the assessment question. And this sort of links in a little bit about that referencing aspect. Referencing is key in relation to the EMA, and I'm not talking about plagiarism. I'm talking about using referencing, one, to show the research that you have put into the actual TMA or should I say the EMA. The other element is it also highlights your own individual contribution. So that independent argument is ultimately what both modules are striving to get from you, is your own independent and confident interpretation of those ancient sources in terms of answering the assessment question. These sort of key skills sort of is about communicating. The communicating aspect is writing an EMA. As I've said to you, many cases I get quite frustrated in looking at TMA and EMA is because I can see that the text that's been presented in front of me is showing engagement with those ancient sources, but is not showing me through that discussion how it is actually answering the question. So that's something I would like you to seriously think about when you're going back over the EMA is when you finish a paragraph, reflect on it. Think about, have I used an ancient source? Have I used modern scholarship to help me with that interpretation? Do I need to use modern scholarship in relation to that? But ultimately, it should have at the end of the paragraph a sort of signpost to you, but more in particular to the assessor, because that's what you're writing towards, showing this is how it actually answers the question. So you make a point in relation to the assessment question, you use evidence coming from those ancient sources, you reference those ancient sources, possibly using modern scholarship or a number of modern scholarship in relation to that. And the last sentence is offering a sort of conclusion at the end of that paragraph that links back in to show that this is answering the assessment question. In some ways, it sounds a little bit clinical, but that's what you need to do. So using criteria in terms of that communication aspect, I suppose that fits into referencing. It talked about ICT skills, don't worry about that, but referencing here, working independently, learning strategies, that's learning strategies, something that I suppose you can, that's one of those life things I'm still trying to deal with myself. Reflecting on the view of others, in some ways, I know this is taught about in relation to A229, where you had that sort of communal forum area. But think about the view of others. Is think about one way of looking at it is think about not just about feedback from tutors, but ultimately how you're engaging with that modern scholarship and using that to help you in terms of that interpretation. Planning, blah, blah. We don't really need all that sort of stuff, but it's just scholarly convention is really important. So if just take the three key aspects in relation to those learning outcomes that are really shared between A229 and A340 is use and focus on those ancient sources. I cannot emphasize enough how important the ancient sources or primary sources are. They are the evidence that you will use. There is no other evidence. Modern scholarship is often called a source material, secondary sources, but that should be built upon those ancient sources. I want to try and move people away from following modern scholarship and developing and ultimately developing their argument from those ancient sources, evidence-based coming from those ancient sources. The last part here, which I've already sort of been moving towards giving you sort of impressions about how to help you in relation to that, is produce an argumentative and persuasive essay. As I said to you, Are you convinced yourself? If you're fairly convinced, then the assessor will probably convince. But how are you convinced? How are you doing that convincing aspect? By using evidence, but also by having that text that is linked in to the actual assessment question. So getting back into the role of the emperor, I've already talked a little bit about aspects of that. There's lots of information out there. So what sort of information is useful to you? So there are different types of source material, and I've already suggested to you what those source materials are. So I'm going to go into a little bit more depth in relation to that. And this should help you in terms of prioritizing their roles, but ultimately help you in how you focus on and deal with and engage with ultimately a TMA, but focusing on the EMA in this particular setting. They're divided up into three different types of sources. Really, the first two are important. Tertiary sources is one that often tends to get forgotten about. But if we're talking about primary source or ancient sources come from the ancient world, secondary source will be modern scholarship, but tertiary sources are dictionaries. So Oxford Classical Dictionaries, encyclopedias and bibliographies, things like that. So they can be very useful to give you a sort of presentation of a broader narrative of a topic area. So if you're looking at the emperor, it might say where the word emperor comes from, talk about some of the great emperors such as Augustus and say what the emperor role is. Just gives you a sort of general idea. As it says here, it doesn't tend to analyze or interpret. It is giving you that sort of factual information. Another sort of, well, I suppose maybe a tertiary source that we're not supposed to deal with, but we all have a look at is the likes of Wikipedia. But you will find that that sort of presentation of information is often seen as a tertiary source. As I said to you, it's just what seems to come across as factual information. It will often incorporate the two other types of source materials, primary source and secondary scholarship, blend those in together, but you won't necessarily see, because they will rarely see references in relation to tertiary sources. The other source is secondary source, and this one I'll try to encourage you to think about how it's used and how to use this much more effectively. And this is often the difficulty that a lot of students face moving from level one to level two, is moving away from, shall we say, the crutch of modern scholarship and following modern scholarship. You might often feel like, well, who am I to go and sort of question these individuals? That's your job. You're a scholar. You need to do what they do, and they develop their argument ultimately coming from those ancient sources. So what is the role of secondary scholarship? It does have different roles in the process of putting together an actual EMA. The first one is, say, for example, you're dealing with a question on the emperor, you don't really know much about the topic area. So what you'll do is you can't suddenly transport yourself back into the past. You can't necessarily pick up the likes of which you could do, I suppose, is pick up Suetonius and start reading about Augustus or whatever it is. One way to do that is to use modern scholarship, and modern scholarship will help you to have that general sort of context information, that general narrative of the classical world, which will ultimately help you to assess and evaluate those ancient sources. It's just giving you some idea about what's going on. Sort of, in some ways, people sometimes often say it's sort of a bit of a scaffold to help you to understand both the question and how you might approach it. Because this question at the stage is quite raw, and you need to try and understand that question. So initial engagement of that assessment question, and then read about it in what it would be, modern scholarship, or the actual other aspect of modern scholarship that I didn't mention is block material. So, for example, with a 229, for looking at option 1, you would look at block 1. For looking at option 2, which is the Roman option, I should have said that, you'd be looking at block 3. For A340, you need to go and, depending on which area you want to focus on and the various different blocks of the actual module itself. So for example, if we're choosing the Emperor, you would normally pick block 2, but there's obviously aspects of the Emperor in block 1 and the same with block 3, etc., etc. But it'll help you in terms of how you might think about the question itself in a bit more depth, and ultimately how you perhaps help you choosing your ancient sources and think about how you would engage those ancient sources initially. So the difference between those ancient primary source and modern scholarship is modern scholarship will help you to access gain access to the classical world. It's not, as I said, you can't be transported in the past. You can't walk into the British Museum and go to one of the security guards and say, would you mind taking the lid off the display case so I can have a look at that particular artifact? You can't do that. You can't necessarily go directly to one of the manuscripts that are preserved from the past. You'll be reading a translation of that. So it just allows you to have that view into the past. Modern scholarship itself should be based upon those ancient sources. So as I said to you, it gives you a view into the past. Not absolutely everything. It is an interpretation. It's that modern scholars' interpretation of the past from their analysis, assessment, and evaluation of those ancient sources. They will have a question in their mind they're asking themselves when they're writing. It won't obviously be the EMA question, but it'll be something reasonably similar, or at least there will be information that will be overlapped that you will allow you to have that initial viewpoint into the ancient world. And you'll still find, even if you've written your EMA, think you know the topic fairly well, there'll be still lots of more information that you could actually include into it. But this is one of the reasons why they have a cut-off date for the EMA and also a word count for the EMA. The main source and most important are primary and ancient sources, and they are the artifacts from the past. Now, I know sometimes there can be a little bit of ambiguity here. So an obvious, clear primary ancient source is going to be archaeological remains. Now, when we're looking at the literary sources, in particular, literary source that might be a historical source, such as Suetonius, Thucydides, Herodotus, they're technically secondary sources, but they are primary sources that come from the ancient world. So I should say they are an ancient source that come from the classical world. So there is a slight little bit of ambiguity here, but when you're not normally talking about primary source, you're talking about sources that come from the ancient world. Hence, that's why I prefer to use the term ancient rather than primary sources. But if you're confident about thinking about the distinction between, an ancient secondary source, a historical source, bring that into your essay and bring that into the EMA argument to say that some of the limitations of or the benefits of that source to show your assessor that you're aware of the different types of ways you can look at actual source material. So, giving you an example of a primary source, and this is where secondary sources is helpful. If I plunked you into the likes of, I don't know if you know what we're looking at here, this is Pompeii. And this is one of those roads into Pompeii. The center areas we're looking at a shop at Tabernae. But if I just plop you there, you wouldn't know where you were. You might not necessarily know where you are in Pompeii. I do because I found the picture. But you need to think about modern scholarship as being like a tour guide. They're giving you a view, sort of information to help you understand not just the location, but some of the aspects and the features that you'd be looking around in relation to Pompeii itself. Now, as I said, this seems to be quite it was a commercial street, sort of a street that doesn't seem that important, but actually behind you is the theatre district in Pompeii. But obviously the tour guide will be able to point all of that out to you. But that's hopefully this sort of analogy will help you in relation to understanding the difference between primary sources and secondary sources, ancient sources and modern scholarship. The tour guide is just providing that information to help you with the interpretation of what you see that's being presented in front of you from the portfolio of those ancient sources, or those ancient sources that you have found through your reading and engagement with the text, the block material, whether it be in A229 or A340. As I said to you, with A340, you do need to find additional sources to incorporate and add on to those sources you've chosen from the portfolio in A340. So that'll give you a better understanding of how you might approach the emperor, sort of aspects of that. So you might have, for example, in this case, think about, well, he has a military role, he has a governance role, he deals with nice pictures and coins, etc., etc. So you'd have a bit of a list of some ideas about what the emperor does. You might also have an idea about, well, I know the name of particular emperors, such as Augustus, Hadrian, Trajan, Antonius Pius. You'll have some of these names, but it's sort of general information. At least you've got that knowledge in your head, but you can't just dump that into a EMA or TMA question because you're not presenting evidence. You're just presenting information. As I said to you, that information needs to come from evidence from those ancient sources to help you develop that persuasive argument ultimately to the EMA question. And you are not retelling history. So if I gave you that question about the emperor, what is the role of the emperor? You are not going to be able to fit that in. You'd be able to put something together in 3,000 words, but ultimately it's not going to be effective. So you need to think about what you need to do after you understand the assessment question. Ultimately, the emphasis is, as I said to you, not covering anything, but focusing in critical depth, the analytical aspect that we are talking about earlier on in relation to those ancient sources, to use the evidence from those ancient sources which you've assessed and evaluated to answer the EMA question. That is what you need to do. So this is where that work that you've done in gaining some general knowledge to help you understand and really appreciate the assessment question. You are now using that information not just to understand the assessment question, but to help you to engage with those ancient sources. So in level 2, A229, you need to use at least 5 primary sources from the portfolio. As I said to you in option 1, there is 10 sources in option, which is the Greek option. Option 2, Roman option, you've got 10 sources. For level 3, you need to use at least 3 of the primary sources provided in the portfolio and further underpinned by your own selection of evidence drawn from primary sources from the reading material and ultimately supported by secondary scholarship, which you would do in the other one. So you need to find, it's up to you, maybe 2 to 3 I would recommend other good ancient source to help you with those 3 sources you must take from the portfolio for A340. You can, if you wish, use the other sources from the portfolio of ancient sources in relation to A340, but it depends on the value of those sources that you've chosen. Often it's sometimes a good idea to find a source that's reasonably similar to some of those sources you've chosen. When I say reasonably similar, I'm not saying obviously like for like, but help you in terms of some of those ideas and concepts you've gained from your analysis and evaluation, that in-depth analysis from those ancient sources. So, oh yeah, I did highlight that to be clever. So the focus needs to be on those ancient sources. The role of modern scholarship is sort of ended, but it's in the back of your mind at this stage. When I say it's ended for now. So you need to focus on that evidence-based argument built from those, not following modern scholarship. You're putting into practice everything that you've done from TMA 1 to TMA 5 to now dealing with the actual EMA. As I said, only those ancient sources count as evidence. And my desperate effort to try and make you excited about the portfolio of ancient sources. So how many ancient sources? It really does depend, but you need to at least do the minimum from the guidance notes. Sorry, that's my dog having a nightmare in the background. I don't know if you can hear that. So you need to use at least 5 from A229, 3 from the portfolio from A340 plus some additional ones. So how many? It really, as I said to you, depends. Now, this is me looking at it in a very, very clinical way. It's just a suggestion. So you got 3,000 words to play with. Now, if you think back over the thing, I'm suggesting that you just, in a very, very clinical, I'm not saying exactly 500, but see an ancient source as being almost like 500 words through that sort of engagement and incorporation ultimately in those sources. So that would suggest to me that for an essay with 3,000 words, you're really looking at around sort of 6 sources maximum, but I would generally sort of suggest maybe around 5 because it's depth of engagement that's more important. So where am I coming with this 500? As I said, it's just a suggestion. More or less comes from source analyses. It's a little bit less easy to do in relation to A340, but A229, you'll see there's an awful lot of 500 in relation to the assessment. So in TMA1, 500 words source analysis. TMA4, source analysis, 500 words. TMA3, looking at 2 ancient sources, 1,000 words, so 500, 500. TMA4, using the source analysis from part 1, plus at least 2 other sources, again, 500. So it's just giving you a general idea. I have read lots of TMAs and EMAs that have actually used more than what I'm suggesting here and have worked at it very, very effectively and done a really good job in relation to the assessment question. I'm not saying that they didn't get distinctions, some of them did get distinctions, but it's just to give you an indication because I don't want you to feel that you need to engage with absolutely every source in the portfolio because it is quite a lot of work. My emphasis is on depth of engagement rather than breadth. So breadth tends to be knowledge, which would be almost, if I'm exaggerating, as I said to you a little bit earlier on, almost like your listing. It is about that understanding, that persuasive aspect of that engagement, those ancient sources to help you answering the assessment question. Not a great graph. The one again I found is, but it sort of gives you an indication about, how important that understanding aspect. So it's almost like suggesting that, moving you away from that knowledge aspect you might have gained from school or watching documentaries and stuff, you'll notice that when you're reading through the module material, your knowledge is and your understanding is getting much deeper. Really, you're starting to use that knowledge to help in terms of that development of understanding. It's no longer that passive aspect that you might have had when you're in school. Certainly, I know from assessing A-level stuff, there's a lot of understanding there, but maybe it depends, you might be returning, after from you might not never have done sort of classical studies as a subject area in secondary school, but you did a bit in primary school, or you just might just love the topic, but you're really starting to develop that understanding. And looking at the towards a PhD level, it is all that focus on that understanding, really using that knowledge, and that's what you need to start thinking about. You are using your knowledge to express your deeper understanding. So this one I think is quite tacky and it just still amuses me. It's about lots of people know you, but very few people understand you. So you need to show that you're just not just knowing these sources, you need to show that you understand these sources, empathize with these sources, that, they are important to you in your actual essay. So constant reminders about focusing on those ancient sources as being important. So what are you actually doing with those ancient sources? And this is what I was trying to explain a little bit earlier on about that in-depth assessment and evaluation of those, is you're looking for those meaningful patterns in the evidence. So you need to see yourself a little bit like a detective. I know sometimes these things come across being a little bit tacky, but you're going into, shall we say, a crime scene, lots of bits of evidence together, and you need to try and put together a picture by using all this evidence, that a credible picture as to what you think might have happened. That's sort of what you were doing with those ancient sources. So you're looking at those individually, but then you're putting them together to answer or give a credible explanation as to how this crime took place. So that's what I mean about those meaningful patterns. So seeking to understand and develop those ideas to show an understanding, using that knowledge to show an understanding of what might have taken place in that particular scene. One of the dangers that happens is, and I'm using Bernard Shaw here because he'd be articulated much more better than I do, is why you need to focus on those ancient sources and not modern scholarship. As I said to you, modern scholarship can often be a crutch. Other things that is a danger, and this is where I talk about that detached objectivity, is you need to assess these individual ancient sources on their own merit. You will, and everyone is guilty of doing that. Lots of scholars will pretend that they look at these things in an objective way, but you need to try and detach that emotional baggage or that cultural baggage that you have and look at the ancient sources in an objective manner. What you're trying to do is let those ancient sources speak for themselves rather than imposing your ideas that you have personally or imposing those ideas that you've gained from modern scholarship. So that's why I'm telling you to focus and build your argument from those ancient sources. And I think it's quite nicely explained here about you become blind to arguments against it. You need to think about the argument, the persuasive argument that you're building, but also think about how you might counter some of those arguments and incorporate that counter argument in your actual discussion. Hence, that's why you need what you did for those who are doing A2 or did A229, why TMA5 was designed in the way it was. It's frustrating because you're just focusing on one side of the argument, but it's to help you to make it as strong as possible, also how you might use counter arguments to make your own argument stronger. So it is all about that engagement of those ancient sources. It's not a singular engagement of those ancient sources, it's a continuous engagement. And so that's why I talked to you a little bit about that reflective aspect. Moving away from your initial engagement with those ancient sources, and your ideas will change from reading scholarship, or more likely, your ideas and interpretations to develop further by comparing that ancient source with another ancient source in relation to that assessment question. So the idea I'm trying to get you to move towards, and by this illustration, whether it's tacky or not, is start with your initial engagements with an individual ancient source, look at it from different angles. The more you look at it, the more you reflect upon it and you incorporate other ancient sources. So hopefully you'll have a nice, juicy EMA at the actual end. You could use in terms to help you with your analysis of those individual ancient sources, use this structure. Personally, I don't like it, but this is where that 500 words comes from. But what I would suggest to you is to use some of the key terms in relation to that. These key terms would be content, form, context. Not necessarily talk about the value of the source, but talk about some of the limitations or strengths of this source to your actual assessment question. Why I'm suggesting that you use content, form, and context is part of the module learning outcomes is to show the assessor how that you've engaged with some of the concepts and ideas of the actual module. So one way that I would suggest that you do that is use these signpost words as part of your incorporation and engagement of those ancient sources to help you to structure some of your ideas, or not necessarily structure, but signpost how you're using aspects of the module material to assess, evaluate these sources to address and put together your argumentative and persuasive essay to addressing the assessment question. So in terms of engaging with these sources, I couldn't think of a better way of doing this. So it's not brilliant, but it's hopefully it's. What you'll do is you look at your first ancient source. That's what AS1 is, and you'll have sort of general knowledge of that from you. This is my suggested approach from that general knowledge of reading that modern scholarship. Remember, I said to you your scholarship ends, your reading of your scholarship ends when your understanding of the assessment question. This is where you reintroduce that sort of general knowledge, that scaffolding that you've gained, and you look at your ancient source and you think like, oh, this is what it sort of suggests to me in terms of the emperor. You're just looking at that ancient source, and hopefully you'll have a few points in relation to that through that examination. So I don't know how many points you might have. I'm just using a sort of illustration here is that you might have 3 or 4 points that you've gained from that ancient source. Then you need to engage with it much further using context information. That context information will generally come from modern scholarship. So it might be an introduction to the work of Homer or something like that, or it might come from the module material. That will help you with that context aspect. So what it is building upon that general context information you've gained from your general reading about the topic, but more specific stuff, which might come from a tertiary source, but it's more than likely come from a secondary source. So this is where you would use modern scholarship to aid you with the interpretation of those ancient sources. But it's the context information will help you to understand those points that you've gained from your initial engagement of that ancient source. So you might have 3 good points that you've gained from that ancient source. There might be an awful lot more, but I said you need to prioritize it. I'm just putting 3 points because it was 3 points fitted better into the actual screen that I was trying to demonstrate. So this is where the role of secondary scholarship evolves from that general information to help you with gaining that deeper understanding of the context of an ancient source, to help you, as I said to you, that critical engagement those ancient sources and ways of thinking about that ancient source and how it might be interpreted. Some of those interpretations you might agree with. If you agree with it, do bring in that saying, Jones says this about the source, to show that you've done that research and reference it. You can disagree with that modern interpretation and do that, but so long as you've got a reasonable argument to say why it's not credible. Don't just simply dismiss it and not include it. You're showing that you're engaging with that modern scholarship, and that shows that you're strengthening your argument, not weakening your argument by engaging with that modern scholarship, and that will help you towards those higher grades. Sometimes when I talk about that contested nature, two different scholars will have two different impressions about that source. I know sometimes it depends upon the questions they're asking, but bring that into your discussion. Say Smith and Jones disagree about this. I personally think that Smith's one is better because of these reasons. Shows that you've done the research in two different sources, but also that you're engaging with it. This is where referencing can be really useful to show the research that you have done in terms of that engagement of those ancient sources. Then you'd follow through on doing this, looking at ancient source 2, you'd examine it from that general knowledge that you've gained. You will again look at the context of that source to explain some of those points, and what you'll have is, say, possibly 3 points from your engagement of that ancient source. But you need to remember, and this is something I said to you very much earlier on, although we're looking at ancient sources, they're not the same. They might all be fruit, but apples and oranges are not equal to each other, but they are still fruit, and they make a contribution towards that fruit cocktail that is ultimately going to be your EMA. So think about that when you're dealing with those ancient sources. So remember, the type of ancient source you're dealing with. So although you're not comparing like with like, do think about, those aspects that are shared, but also bring out the limitation so you can prioritize the aspects of one of those sources over the other source, which helps to deepen that engagement of the ancient sources in general. But it does depend, I know, again, on your confidence. What you might end up is 7 points. The ones put in green are those ones that are very strongly shared between those two sources. The amber ones or yellow ones here, those are sort of might be sort of shared a little bit. And the one that's red down here in the bottom is only in existence of one source. Now, most of what you'll be focusing, like in a Venn diagram, is the areas that are shared between those two sources. But you might find that the last source, that might only be in ancient source 1, is a really important point. Don't dismiss that. If you think that's a really important point and you can justify why that is significant, include that in your EMA and say that although these points are shared by the other two sources, three source, four source, or whatever, a really significant point that's only in one source, and that source is really important, is this point. So show that it's absent from other sources. Again, it shows your confidence in terms of engaging with those ancient sources. And this is where that reflective aspect comes into it and developing those ideas. And this is what I'm saying is weighing your sources against each other or weighing those points against each other. And this is where that value of the sources from that single source analysis is important, because you need to think about, okay, the value of this source, how does that value against another source? It's where you're bringing these sources together and bringing that, as I said to you, that critical depth into your discussion. Now, I've showed this in A229 and I always get into trouble because people think that I don't like cats or I don't like dogs, but it's not the case. I've had both. This is not necessarily a really good view of the, cats and dogs generally. But, as I said to you, most things you might focus on the middle bits, but there might be aspects that are really significant in terms of that might be just applicable to dogs or apples, just focusing maybe really important in relation to cats and oranges, for example. Bring that into your discussion that you still think they're really important, but you'll probably start off your essay focusing on those clear points that are shared between those sources. So investigate some of those similarities, but also differences in relation to the assessment of question and account for these. Accounting for these will probably come from the type of source material you're looking at, or it might be because the source itself is just an extract from the wider source. There might be aspects that will help you in relation to that. Overall about this is the point is trying to give an extra depth to your engagement of those ancient sources, helping you weave those sources against each other. A lot of people will tend to take a source by source approach. I'm trying to push you slightly away from that, or totally push you away from that and looking at different points and different themes or and way of looking at the past, because this allows you to weave your sources much more closely together. And often this is where you'll get the stronger EMA answers, because sometimes if you take a very source by source approach, often it tends to be sort of quite descriptive, and you want to try and reduce that descriptive aspect and focusing on that critical engagement of those ancient sources. So you would follow through. I'm not saying that you need to do this literally on looking at your third source, doing the same process, points from that, and ultimately you'll have, it does look like sort of virus attack, doesn't it? But I'm just saying about 6 different sources. You looked at it initially, you'd start looking at the context to help you with that, and you'll have different points. So your essay, your EMA would be a list, or what you would use, a list of these sort of main points that you gain. The green ones are shared between most of these sources. The amber ones said quite a number of these sources, and the ones in red there is only shared by maybe one or two or just one source. You would use this to help sort of structure your assessment together. So what you'll find is the green ones, you say in source one we can see this, source two we can see this, source three we can see this, and obviously not stating it like that, but you're doing it in a much more sort of nuanced and intellectual way of writing together. So where does the role of that modern scholarship come into this again? Now, I suppose I'm talking a little bit more in relation to A340. Modern scholarship can be a useful source for finding those ancient sources that you need to use in addition to the source from the portfolio. If you decide to go outside the portfolio of ancient source in relation to A340. And I'd advise you to do that. So try and find something that's similar. So they will be useful. So when you're reading modern scholarship is, if I was talking at the start of the module, say is, stop every now and again, always ask yourself, what is the evidence for this? And that's what you need to think about when you're writing your essay as well, your EMA, is what am I giving good, strong evidence in relation to that? And that's why I'm saying to you in terms of weaving these sources together. If you think about the evidence of 5 sources, it's going to be better than the evidence necessarily of one source. So that's why I think about that weaving together can be quite a stronger way of putting together your actual EMA. If you are taking a source by source approach, do evaluate these sources against each other. Again, helps you with that depth of engagement, even if you're taking a source by source approach. So be excited about those ancient sources. So my suggestion is sort of planning and structuring your EMA along the points that you have gained through your source analysis. And this should, as I said, to give your assessment much greater critical depth than a source by source approach. But again, it depends. I suppose this is not really the time to go and sort of try out new ways of doing things, but do what's comfortable for you. But if you are going from A229 and moving into A340, maybe in the first TMA2, TMA3 of that, you might start thinking about breaking away from that source by source approach. But it's really up to yourself. The point I've been trying to make to you is follow the evidence, let the ancient sources speak to you and not simply following modern scholarship, because that is what got you that pass grade, but you need to thinking about what do you really need to try and achieve to get those top grade, which is following through, and why I pointed out the module learning outcomes is using those ancient sources effectively. So it doesn't matter if it's written by Mary Beard. You want to look at what Mary Beard is using as evidence. You can engage with her in terms of her interpretation, but you're more interested in how she's actually using evidence that you might want to use as a model or incorporate that into your discussion. Oh dear. But when you're planning the essay, do make sure that you're keeping the assessment question in your mind and listing your points in terms of, or prioritizing your points into a hierarchy, what you think is most significant, and working downwards. And generally, as I said to you, there'll be a lot of pruning. The skill in terms of writing an EMA or any essay is not just what you include, but also what you leave out. You can't, as I said to you, cover everything. So you might find that when you've looked at 2 sources against each other, you've got 10 points, and then when you look at 3, you've got 15. So you need to sort of, oh, I can't really include all of these. So which ones am I going to prioritize? What do I think are going to be key points? So as I said, you can't include absolutely everything. So when you start planning your essay, you need to think about not just the logical progression, but what you think are going to be the most relevant points that will help you in terms of that persuasive argument. But I always keep the assessment question in your mind. The assessment question is going to be your focus all the way through. So plans do change. So like what this text is looking at different types of evidence. So that can sometimes come out through your reflection, whether whatever you're doing is, whether you're washing the dishes or you're going out to work, going to work or coming back from work, some ideas will change. So don't think that because you've come up with a plan that you can't change it. It's not something that's written in stone. That's part of that reflective process, but it's just giving you a sort of, again, going using that analogy of a scaffold to try and think about guiding you through. But ultimately, as you're going through the essay, there will be still making adjustments that are there. So argument and points, you're looking for that meaningful pattern in relation to the actual evidence itself. Now, how many points? It really does depend. Now, if you're using a source by source approach, often what will happen is those points will come through each of those sources that you go through. This, again, I was just doing some research and essays and think about the general approach is perhaps maybe 6 to 8 points in a 3,000 word EMA. Now, this is general discussion in relation to that. I think this is probably a little bit less, a little bit too sparing about, maybe 200 to 300 words per paragraph, but I have never really sort of actually thought about myself. But just gives you a little bit of an indication. It also sort of gives you an idea in terms about, what percentage might you give. Now, this is just very, very clinical way of looking, sort of rule of thumb. Maybe a 10% in relation to an introduction, 15% for a conclusion. 1,000 word essay would be looking about 3 to 4 points. 3,000 looking for 7 to 8. But I think 7 to 8, 12 points is far too many, but I know I'd be erring towards a little bit more towards 7, but it really depends on the actual points that you're incorporating and the level of engagement that you have in relation to those points. The one thing I do want to try and move you away from, again, taking things to an extreme, is almost having a paragraph EMA with an introduction, conclusion, and a huge middle bit. Using those paragraphs to help and aid your assessor read through your discussion to try and show and illustrate how successful you've been in terms of your research and engaging with those ancient sources by making the job easier for the assessor to get through it, making your points clear. It really does help the assessor in relation to getting through your EMA, always based upon those ancient sources. So what I want to do now is quickly run through some general suggestions in relation to writing an essay. What I've been trying to do is sort of break down the journey as much as possible. I said to a module's journey, but ultimately an EMA itself is a journey, even in these few weeks that we have in relation to the submission date of the actual EMA itself. Now, 3 does tend to be really important, and hence that's why I'm sort of bringing my Irish background into it. And let's go back to Aristotle, moving away from the rhetoric bit aspect and looking at his treatise on the poetics, which is really focusing on tragedy. And this one sort of amused me no end, and hence when I found this picture, I sort of felt like Aristotle here is just sort of saying like, look, it's not my fault. But this is looking at dramatic theory, and he often gets blamed for the creation of an essay having a beginning, a middle, and an end. But that's totally not true. What he's doing is talking about the structure of a piece of drama, which has to have a beginning, it has to have a middle, it also has to have an end bit. And you can see, okay, admittedly, this is coming from translation, but I think it's quite amusing the way he describes the beginning. This is the beginning, that's at the start, the middle bit is in the middle, and the end bit is at the end. But, it's just sort of slightly amusing in my view in terms of how he might look at these structural aspects of an essay. So what is the beginning? And this is something that I tend to get. It may be just about me. I'm sort of getting a bit cranky over the years. I'm probably getting more cranky as we go along about how you use your introduction effectively. When you meet somebody for the first time, you do need to see that the submission of your EMA and your introduction is like meeting a person for the first time. You don't shove a load of information into their face. What you do is start with the basic bit of information, which might be just simply, what is your name? I like people to see an introduction as a route map for the journey in which you're engaging them with in the actual EMA. So what you're doing is setting out your position, the central idea of your argument at the very beginning. You're not giving people a lot of general information about the emperors, saying like emperors are really important. They tend to be they were all male, and as such, because they're male, they had certain viewpoints. Blah blah blah. Irrelevant, really, because it's just general information. It's not evidence-based, and it's not actually making a contribution to showing your critical engagement with the assessment question. So what I would like people to do is to use it, as I said, to a route map and produce an introduction that really is a critically active introduction. So what you're doing is engaging with the assessment, explaining your understanding of it, showing the complexity of the question. So what you might do is, for the example, the role of the emperor, you could say there were so many emperors, it's a very difficult question to cover absolutely everything, but what you're going to do is focus on certain parameters, and those parameters would be ultimately come from those ancient sources. You're already establishing a boundary in it. Showing your understanding of the question is not saying to the assessor, putting the question into your own mind. You need to think about going back into the learning outcomes I said to you a bit earlier on about the assessment question, EMA question as communication. You are communicating to an audience. That audience is the assessor. So you're explaining to the assessor your understanding of the assessment question, part of that persuasive aspect. Sometimes what happens is, and this is where I get sometimes have found a bit frustrating, is I didn't really know where the essay was going until the conclusion. What you're doing is setting up at the very beginning, this is your position in relation to the assessment question. I'm not necessarily saying you're giving away the answer, but by ultimately telling the assessor where you're going, says, this is where I'm going with this question, and now you need to test me in relation to that. It's also, as I said to you, not just signposting to the assessor where you're going with this, giving them confidence in the journey they're going with, but also it's signposts to you that you need to make sure that you're tied back into this assessment question. You would also set out your approach. The approach might be, as I said to you, about a thematic approach, which is different points in relation to the assessment question, or a source by source approach. You might want to say in terms of that approach would be, part of it would be listing those ancient sources, as I've suggested to you. So when you're listing those ancient sources from the portfolio, you're not referencing those. You're just saying, going to be looking at 5 of those ancient sources from the portfolio for A229 or 6, and these are sources going to be this source, that source. It might be predominantly literary source. I'm going to look at source from Homer, just flagging up, this is the boundaries, and this is what I'm going to be you need to test me on my engagement with these ancient sources. So it does not leave the assessor into a position saying, oh, if only they had included this source. That is not what you're using to answer the question. The sources that you have chosen are what you're testing yourself, and the assessor is going to be testing you again. So you're telling the assessor not just your approach to the question, but this is how I'm going to do it, and they're assessing you against that. It also, by engaging with the assessment question, reduces that ambiguity. As I said to you, I have read an awful lot of essays in the past where I wasn't quite sure where they were going in the introduction because they just provide a lot of general information. Starts to engage with those sources. Again, I still really wasn't quite sure where they're going in relation to the assessment question. I knew what the general question was, but I didn't really quite understand, how was that? It wasn't until the conclusion where I knew they were going. So you want to make everything clear and transparent to the assessor themselves. So again, how is that helping in relation to the argument? You're starting about your point is, you're making your claim in your introduction. The premise is you're using that evidence, engaging with that evidence to present sort of a reasonable explanation to justify that claim, and then you're attempting to persuade, which is ultimately what is an argument. Again, I don't know whether this is a very clinical way of looking at whether it'll help you as to relation to what is an argument in relation to that. This is something again from just reading up about presenting an argument in an actual essay. So the body of the essay itself is, really do get into that engagement with those ancient sources, whether you take a thematic approach or whether you take a source by source approach. Again, it can be quite frustrating for me in some ways as an assessor. I'm sure other people says, but again, others might think differently, is general information in your introduction, but often it gets followed through in relation to a paragraph after an introduction that provides general information. It's quite interesting, but as I said to you, think about, is this really contributing to the task that I need to deal with? My task is to engage with critical ancient sources and answer this assessment question. Sometimes you might want to provide definitions. If you are, fair enough, your understanding of a particular word it helps in terms of that boundaries in relation to the assessment question, but that's often best having that in your introduction, as I suggested to earlier. But try to keep your introduction fairly succinct and focused to the task in hand of what the introduction is about. As I was suggesting, maybe about 10% of the overall EMA word count, just a general sort of suggestion. So get into the actual engagement with those ancient sources in the body of the TMA itself. This is going to be the majority of the actual essay itself. At every stage needs to be supported by that evidence which comes through the primary and ancient. You need to show you're critically engaging with that, and that in critical engagement needs to have discussion that shows how it is actually answering the assessment question. You use modern scholarship or secondary scholarship to bring in different viewpoints and points, the methodological approach, some of those wishy-washy terms that are used, really to help with that and support your interpretation or give an alternative interpretation, and so show that you're acknowledging different interpretations. But ultimately, how you saying like this is not so strong in relation to your interpretation of those ancient sources. So try to reduce that descriptive aspect, that sort of narrative aspect of the essay. It need to focus on that critical engagement. Of course, there does need to be a certain level of descriptive material, but the descriptive material should just be there so the assessor knows what you're talking about. The focus needs to be on that critical engagement of those ancient sources. As I said to you a little bit earlier on, do use paragraphs. I've come across so many EMAs that have just these massive, eye-watering paragraphs. Good paragraphs, as I said, divide your assessment according to points or themes, the thematic approach I was talking to you about. Source by source approach often does lead to bigger paragraphs, but do think about how you might break those. It should make a self-contained point. These things should be very clear, and ultimately, after I'm reading in a paragraph, I should have a good idea, even without the assessment question being there, what question you are trying to answer through your actual discussion. Each of these paragraphs should signal a change or progression of your argument. I'll show you a little bit hints as to how you might do that. But as I said to you, each of these paragraphs are clearly linked to the assessment question, even looked at in isolation, and it should have a logical progression. Ultimately, it'll have an introductory sentence and a concluding sentence. Getting back to that point about three, is sometimes you might want to see an introduction, a paragraph as like being a little bit of a mini essay. So you'll have an introduction, which is a single point showing highlighting or signposting the point that you're using to answer the assessment question. The body of that paragraph will have that evidence and that critical engagement of those ancient sources through using that contextual information. You might also have that modern scholarship to help you with that interpretation. And every paragraph should have a reference, with the exception of your introduction and conclusion. That in-text reference should come from those ancient sources, and if you've used modern scholarship, from references to that modern scholarship. As I said to you, you're using these references, not scary about plagiarism, just to show and illustrate the work that you have put into this assessment. So that's why I'm saying to you, particularly if you're using modern scholarship, bring that in. It's just showing the work that you've done, and it allows the assessor to give you credit ultimately for that. The end part of the paragraph should make a clear statement, ultimately reaffirming that point. That's what I'm saying to you about. It should say how that paragraph, that point that you've made, and that evidence and engagement with those ancient sources is answering the assessment question. So as I said to you, I should look at a paragraph, I should have a good idea what the question is just by looking at that paragraph on its own. But ultimately, it's building upon what you've done in your introduction, saying this is the position I'm taking. Second paragraph shows that and supports that. The next paragraph after that is doing exactly the same thing. You might want to use the PEE or the PEL, point, evidence, explain. Depends on how you want to do whatever works for you, but ultimately having introduction, middle bit, and conclusion for each of those paragraphs. Do ask yourself, so what? That'll help you refine that discussion in relation to making it clear and explicit how that point, that engagement of those ancient sources actually answering the question. So do be cruel to yourself and asking that so what. Ultimately, it's all about creating that argument. So what is that argument? We know what arguments are, but we're thinking about an academic argument, which is evidence-based defense. It's coming from that credible evidence that comes through your engagement of those ancient sources and using modern scholarship to aid you with your interpretation of those ancient sources. That's the bread and butter and aspects of how you build an academic argument. So as I said to you, all of it, this ultimately towards convincing your assessor of your position that it has a sound argument based upon that credible evidence with a very clear conclusion, persuading, as I said to you, based upon that evidence you presented in your essay. So in terms of obvious things and sort of general things in relation, make sure that it's making sense. Is it always supported by evidence? Are you weaving those sources in towards a coherent narrative, moving away from that sort of blocky approach, smoothing out over the paragraphs? This is where, the number of times you go over your essay, reflecting on the essay, reflecting on the paragraphs, how they're interrelated to each other. Is your balanced argument balanced? What I mean by balanced is looking at other alternative points of view. It's not looking at the 50-50. It's ultimately helping you to strengthen it in relation to making a strong case, reducing some of that sort of descriptive narrative or the term verbose, which I think sounds quite posh and nice. You're sort of making, as this really helping me create that strong argument and directly relevant to the assessment question, making that explicit. So as I said to you, it's about persuading. Descriptive writing is informing, critically engaging is about persuading. So this is just sort of a way of looking at that, sort of different ways of looking at the sort of moving away from that descriptive into that critical engagement aspect, that reasoned argument about persuading. Looking at things in sort of a sort of bit more structured way of looking at, descriptive is listing, just presenting evidence. You're really arguing a case from the evidence. This is the difference between descriptive and critical, moving away from level 1 into level 2 and into level 3. Your needs at level 2 and level 3, you're focusing on that critical engagement aspect. So ultimately, your main discussion should be based upon those ancient sources. Everything that critical engagement is related to your engagement with that towards addressing the assessment question, following through on your introduction. So as I said to you, introduction is that route map. The body of the essay is the route, and ultimately the conclusion is that final destination where you bring it all together. That's what your conclusion should be about. As I said to you, pulling these things all together, this is where your original thought comes into relation to that assessment question. You're demonstrating how you have answered the question. And when I say to you about demonstrating how you've actually answered the question, it's not using an opening paragraph. As you can see, I have answered the question. When I see that, I know the person hasn't answered the question. They're just trying to sort of be like, they've used sort of descriptive now. It should come fairly clear through the body of the essay, so you don't have a need to say that you have done it. Your conclusion should show that you're doing. So your essay, your conclusion shows about being consistent with the introduction. If you take a position about, I agree with this position in relation to the assessment question, you don't sort of suddenly disagree in your introduction. So this is where you need to look at your essay in a holistic way. You're summarizing the main points and ultimately coming to that crescendo towards the assessment question. The last sentence should have a fairly strong position in relation to the assessment question, even if it is ambiguous. You're saying that, it's difficult to establish, but, it seems that, it could be 50-50. Just and coming towards that position at the end in relation to the assessment question, and never ever include anything new in your conclusion. And as I said to you, it wouldn't have references in your actual conclusion itself. Some ways it might help you in relation to putting your conclusion together is going back over the body of the essay. Think about what are the main conclusions for each of those paragraphs. Will help you in relation to not just refining and making your body of your essay better, but help you in terms of how you might structure your introduction. So helping you in terms of that interrelative aspect in relation to the body of the essay and the conclusion and ultimately your introduction. So the entire essay should be structured and interrelated to each other, making sure that your introduction is showing how you're going to answer the question, the body of the essay is going about it, and the conclusion is how you've actually done that. Referencing and bibliography, one of those sort of difficult things. You'll find that, I should have taken out A229, but you'll find that in the assessment guide. Make sure that you're fairly consistent in terms of referencing. Do include a bibliography. In most cases, what you'll do is if you're using a source from the portfolio, just cut and paste that from the actual assessment question. Just make sure the formatting looks pretty and nice. If you're including or using additional block material, if you're using block material or secondary score, do include that in the bibliography too. It's part of one of those tasks in relation to that. It's about being consistent. So this is sort of general suggestions to where I've been going to in relation to approaching the question. First, look at the question itself in a very general way. So read through what would be relevant block material or modern scholarship to help you focus on how you're understanding the assessment question. That allows you to engage with it in a critical way to prepare you ultimately for starting that engagement in relation to the ancient sources. Look at the ancient source initially, face value, make some points, and then use that context information, which you'll gain in most cases, possibly from a wider aspect of that ancient source or modern scholarship, to explain why those points are the way they are in relation to that particular individual ancient source. Using that context information, what do I mean by that? Context is using that wider information to explain why the source comes across as it comes across. Do think about some of the benefits and limitations in relation to the source itself. As I said to you, it is about that sort of holistic argument. As I said to you, it's not 50-50. So don't just look at it in a sort of one way of looking at things, as you need to do for TMA 5 for 8229. Use that experience to help you to refine and strengthen your argument by acknowledging other arguments and other ways of looking at things. As I said to you, it's just about acknowledging alternatives, not 50-50. It seems a bit of an odd way of looking at things in the balanced argument, but it really is not necessarily doing it in a balanced way. It's really sort of helping to strengthen your own argument, your own argument. Then look at your next ancient source, following through on the process that I've suggested to you. Compare and contrast those sources against each other. Think about those shared aspects, but also those different points, and continue with that process. So it's about reassessing the previous source by looking at the other source. So that's part of that reflective process. Some of those ideas will come through that direct comparison and contrasting. Other cases it might be a little bit later on, or you might wake up in the middle of the night thinking about that source and sort of those themes in relation to the assessment question. As I said to you about try to prioritize, put those sources or those points or hierarchy, put them in, put them into a bit of a hierarchy to help add that critical depth. It's again showing your confidence in engaging with those ancient sources. Don't assume those points are equally the same from each of those sources, because each of those sources will have different values. Some of those values will be are in terms of limitation. Some of them might be because it's said to be an extract, might be a geographical aspect. One of them might be more directly related to the topic in which we're talking about. One of them might be a little bit more distant. Bring this into your discussion to show your confidence and engagement with those ancient sources. As I said, you've talked about the value of the sources for TMA1 for both modules. Bring that into in terms of bringing that into your discussion in the body of the essay by comparing those sources against each other. As I said, to the hierarchy aspect. Look at the next source and continue with that process with all those other sources, but always, always have the assessment question in your mind. Then ultimately, when you've looked at most of your sources or all of your sources, start to plan your essay. You might find that there might be a source that wasn't really as good as you thought it was, and you might go and start to look for another source. But that will still have value in ultimately in terms of your assessment of the previous sources. So you're trying to use those sources and use those points so it'll help you in terms of putting together that ultimate EMA progressive argument. And finally, write your EMA. It ultimately sounds simple, but that's what you need to do. Final things in sort of bringing this all together is presentation. Now, obviously things are much easier nowadays in relation to the EMA because everything will be word processed. In the old days, it used to be written, and there would be some sort of gems of essays that came together. Things be very thick in relation to having Tipex, if people know what I'm talking about. There'd be lots of bits that are crossed out and things like that. Try to make sure that the formatting of your EMA is consistent throughout, not just about the referencing, but the formatting too. Now, it might seem a little bit odd, but in terms of, okay, this one I think is from A229, but it's exactly the same for A340. Technically, your EMA should be double spaced. I don't see why it's necessary, but that's what they're suggesting, and have a margin of at least 4 centimeters towards the left. This is when old days when things were bound. I don't think you need to have that. You can just have that in normal essay, but I'm just pointing this out. This is in the assessment guide. You should incorporate your student identifier. Again, I don't necessarily know why, because it's submitted electronically, and we know, and you would have the person identifier on that. So it's not necessary. Well, I can't remember if you can see it on the actual EMAs, but the assessment people will have all that information. Do include the word count. Um, the word count there is for the actual body of the essay, so not including titles or anything like that. But if you're using in-text referencing, that's part of it. If you're using footnotes, which try to move you away from footnotes, but footnotes also count because they're part of those referencing. Bibliography doesn't count. Don't try to blag it because we'll know when you're reading through it, if something is over the word limit. So don't just try to be reasonably honest in relation to the word count itself. You are permitted to go over 10%, regardless of whether it's A229 or A340, but I'm suggesting to you that you focus on 3,000 words. That should be your target to keep things as succinct as possible. Don't see 3,300 words as the final word count, because you'll find it be frustrating trying to reduce 1 or 2 words. Just focus on trying to keep things succinct and to the point by focusing on 3,000 words. If it's a lot less than 3,000 words, then you need to think about that. Maybe include another ancient source or deepen your critical engagement. But hopefully you won't be put into that position. You're really sort of focusing on, trying to keep it as close to down towards 3,000 words as much as possible. Always make sure that your ancient source is focused and be happy about using those ancient sources. And I thought I'd resurrect this image again. That should have the EMA sorted. When I was looking for this image, I found out the reason why this character is like that. He's eating sand. It's nothing to do with great success, but it did sort of cause me no end of amusement. Right. Any questions on any of that? Hopefully that'll help you in relation to how you might approach the EMA itself. So I don't know, probably bully Cheryl, or maybe if somebody wants to go and put the microphone on, they can ask some questions. I might be able to try and get the question bit to come out. Oh, I can see stuff there. Oh, managed. Now bugger things up again.
Questions on there. When I did A340, a gentleman failed the EMA and he couldn't understand why. And on our Facebook group, he gave us his argument and he had totally failed to answer the question.
Yeah.
And he'd gone off on this massive tangent.
Which, it's in some ways people do get distracted, and this is why it's always important. Now, I don't know, again, it seems like a flippant way of doing things, but I have known students will do that. They'll actually print out the EMA question and stick it up in their study area and have that in front of them all the time, just to remind them. And it is a very basic thing that can often go wrong, is make sure that you answer the assessment question as set and not a question that you've come up with or a question that you've made up yourself. You must answer the assessment question that's there. Relating that to actually marking physical essays in an examination, the strongest answers were those that actually answered the assessment question rather than a model answer that people have just thrown into it. So it is simple as you've just suggested there of answering the assessment question, which can be a bit cruel if you put all that work into it and just sort of forgotten about what the assessment question is.
Yeah. Good. I can't see any questions. Got a couple of thank yous. Susie says thank you.
Well, if there aren't any questions, or maybe people might have a few questions, but I'll just quickly run through, maybe think about what's next. I'm assuming that most people, in some cases, I'm really sort of thinking about that, what next bit would be from A229. But if you're doing A340, you might be thinking about maybe doing A350. What I would suggest you in terms of the progression from A229, I would see the logical progression, if you're just doing a single module, is to follow with A340. I'm hoping that you will follow through in classical studies. because of the assessment structure is fairly similar, which I've pointed out to you, and how you engage with the ancient source and the focus on that is fairly similar. Also, I think next year, maybe the following year, is the final presentation. 2026 is the final presentation of A340, so it is coming towards its end of its life as the current state it's in. A350 is quite different in terms of the assessment structure, but at least it is classical studies. So if you are doing A229, I would advise follow through into A340 rather than doing A350, not just because it's coming towards the end of its life. It's that the skills that you've developed during A229 naturally will help you in relation to A340, but that's just some sort of general points I wanted to suggest in relation to looking towards the future. If you're doing to decide you're one of those stronger students that can do two modules at the same time, fair play to you, great. You might do A340 and A350 together. But as I said to you, if you're just taking a single module pattern, it's more logical to follow through A229 onto A340. So if there aren't any other questions, and if I don't see you at a future EMA tutorial related to A229 or A340, I wish you the very best of luck in relation to the EMA. Hopefully this has helped you in relation to that. I'm happy to pass on the PowerPoints if we can find a way of doing that, because it might be quite useful for you.